2020. Oh, how we wish we could forget you. We've all had collectively just a bit of a struggle with this tumultuous year. I mean, peaks and valleys, I know, but this year, it was that and then some. From the pandemic to George Floyd's killing, the shooting of Breonna Taylor, and the worst economic spiral in over a decade. Oh, right, and there was that whole presidential election thing. There were those headlines we have seared into our heads and those we'd much rather forget. But through it all were our Vice News reporters on the ground telling you what you needed to know. I spoke with several of them about it all as we say goodbye to 2020 and head into a brand new year. Todd Zwillich, you're joining me from D.C. You're the Deputy Bureau Chief for D.C., and it's been a hell of a year for politics, for things happening in Washington. For the election, one thing that you do that I really love is every morning you write us all an email, like updating us on what's happening in D.C. And one of the headings that you've used over and over again is anyone but the voters. It strikes me that 2020 was pretty unique in one party was really in on trying to win an election without getting the most votes. Take me through that. How was that different from years previously? How is it unique? And what does it mean?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for reading the newsletter. You get up in the morning and you type. One thing that Washington doesn't need is another morning politics newsletter. I'm happy that this one is internal. I try to have fun with it, but I'm also happy that you look at it. So thank you for that. Now it's all worthwhile for 2021. Look, I came up with that little header, anybody but the voters, because you keep noticing this pattern throughout the run up to the 2020 election, which was efforts in state after state after state to restrict voting. None of that is new. I mean, voter suppression goes back decades and generations in this country. That's a story we've been telling on Vice News as well, especially in the South, especially in southern states that wanted to repress black votes, but not just there, not in other places too. And it's ramped up. Look, Republicans realized a long time ago that they were a minority party. And they've known for 12 to 16 years that they're increasingly a minority party. If they're going to protect their power, they have to protect it from a minority position. The Constitution lets you do that for all kinds of bad reasons, including the Electoral College and the U.S. Senate. That's a little bit of a preamble. What really ramped this one up this year, Krishna, I think, is COVID. Because when COVID happened and the election was looming, so go back to March and April, everybody started to realize, shit, there's an election coming. This is a disease that doesn't let you stand with others for long periods of time. We need ways to get people to the polls. I think people of both parties realized that at first. And then when the reality of voting during a pandemic started to gel for people over the summer, how bad this was, what social distancing really meant, a light bulb went off with Republicans that Democrats and even some just nonpartisan election authorities in some of the states were going to try to expand voting because pandemic in a way that cut against a decades-long strategy from Republicans, which is anybody but the voters. That's just the way it is. And I think it brought a new kind of urgency and ugliness to this very old concept. So we saw it, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, go across the map. You don't just have to pick the battleground states, expanded with mail-in voting. And from jump, Trump attacked it. From jump, he attacked it. And he attacked it because he was laying a groundwork. And you see that play out even to today, to the tweets that Donald Trump has issued today, alleging massive fraud in the election. From the moment that mail-in voting became a proposal for widespread enfranchisement, or at least pandemic era enfranchisement for Americans, Trump started calling this fraud, an avenue to massive fraud. And Republicans knew it too. Yes, he controls the party, but Trump not only wanted to try to keep Democrats from the polls while getting Republicans to vote. That backfired. I mean, look at the difference between what happened in Pennsylvania, where a lot of Republicans who were urged to vote in person didn't come out until Election Day. Democrats voted in massive numbers by mail, versus Florida, where Republicans there kind of pushed back on this Trump rhetoric about mail-in voting and did vote by mail in massive numbers. Trump won Florida. He won. So you contrast sort of the electoral strategy with what a lot of us recognized at the beginning as a groundwork strategy, that no matter the results of this election, Trump was preparing to do what he's always done, which is allege fraud and deny he lost. He did it in the primaries. He did it in Iowa when he lost the Iowa primary to Ted Cruz. He accused Ted Cruz of massive fraud. Sorry, Iowa didn't have primaries; they had caucuses. Accused Ted Cruz of massive fraud. He did it when he won the election in 2016 and alleged massive fraud and illegal voting in places like California to justify the fact that he hadn't won the popular vote. So he was definitely going to do it in 2020. To lay a groundwork for either challenging the election or challenging the validity of the election. And here we are. I don't have to explain where we are. It's led to an attempted coup. That was ham-handed, that didn't work, that was laughable at times, really sad at others, but an attempted coup nonetheless. And I just cast my mind back to, March, April, even February of last year, writing dumb little missives about anybody but the voters, some voter suppression, extending early voting deadlines in some state to what it's become, which was an attempted coup, a failed one.
Well, and my mind goes back to the USPS, the United States Postal Service, and how that became a politicized part of the government because mail-in voting was obviously going to be something that a lot of states wanted to do, but then the president and people in his administration were like, no, that's not cool. We had a newsletter that we put out, even a physical newsletter, about sort of the U.S. mail. Can you, thinking about anyone but the voters for the last 4 years, for however long, did you ever think that the mail service would be such a political body here in the United States? I mean, it's kind of absurd when you think about it.
Yeah, I was thinking the other day, I was standing on a street corner and I saw a blue mailbox. You don't see them as much as you used to, but and it just struck me, remember during election day or pre-election day, there were little kids dressing up as mailboxes right before the election, or mailboxes became a hot Halloween costume for kids, probably for the children of Democrats, I guess, since everything is stacked these days. But I just thought, here we are, it had to be this year that something as fundamentally boring, as fundamentally mundane as the mail became highly politicized. It became politicized with good reason. Donald Trump installed a crony as Postmaster General, who showed all the markings of both personal and election corruption leading up. Now, Democrats, uncharacteristically in Congress, got wise to this, and they're kind of famous for dropping the ball when it's really important in terms of political pressure. This is one they got right. They really ramped up the pressure on Louis DeJoy and forced him to backtrack on a lot of the policies. I don't think we actually know if the backtracking on the physical policies, like the mail sorting machines and the letter carriers and the hours, if in the end all that made much difference for the number of ballots that got to Election Central in order to be counted on time. But what it did do was it crystallized public and frankly journalist attention on the fact that there was an attempt here to use the levers of government to steal the election. And it was Donald Trump's attempt. This was one of many facets of it, but it was real. And whether people called it that or not, people started to realize what was going on here, even if whatever sorting machine in Oregon wasn't going to be reconstituted in time for the election. And I think that made a huge difference.
The mail story was something that journalists were on top of early, and that kind of pushed some government action. At least it made people aware that sorting machines were being, taken away. Just something was happening, right? Take me through that. It was pretty cool in a sense.
Yeah. Look, I put on journalism, media criticism hat for 1 second. I think that journalism, political journalism, I guess, actually has done a pretty good job during the election and since calling Donald Trump's coup attempt what it is. Now, not everybody uses that language. I'm using that language, but very, very few places that aren't, fringe publications or designed for propaganda really pursued or covered in a credulous way Donald Trump's claims of fraud or massive mail-in voter fraud. One of the effects of Donald Trump sort of laying the groundwork that mail-in balloting is fraudulent for all these many months leading up to the election is that it gave everybody a pretty long runway, because everybody who cared to look knew what he was trying to prepare for. Right? Everybody knew that Pennsylvania was going to count all the in-person ballots, that it would look like Republicans are ahead, then they'd count all the mail-in ballots over the next week, and then it would equalize. Everybody who cared to pay attention already knew this. I think that people in our guild did a pretty good job of being prepared for that, of not sort of falling for both sidesism when it came to fraud or massive fraud or stealing the election. I'm a little less enthusiastic. I'm a little less sanguine about going forward here and the beginning of the Biden presidency. And this may be a little bit of an internal Washington thing. I think it's normal. I think all of us are personally and probably professionally longing to get back to normalcy, to say, oh, that was a weird episode. That was totally bizarre and mind-splitting. After January 20th, no matter what else happens, Joe Biden's a regular guy. It won't be a daily deluge of Twitter bullshit and lies about everything all the time, regardless of what your policy leanings are on tax policy or whatever. And I'm a little worried about that, because I think that everybody has so much inertia to get back to normal that they're missing some of the fundamentals of what's happened to the Republican Party, about its turn to authoritarianism, about its failure to police authoritarianism in its own ranks, and about a lot of Republicans who are sort of now retreating to an old style of both sidesism that reporters naturally makes them feel safe to be in the middle of both sides of a story. A Biden aide in the transition calls Republicans fuckers. They're fuckers. And a lot of Republicans pretend to be extremely offended by this, and she's forced to apologize. Now, I don't condone calling people professionally fuckers necessarily, but we don't have to pretend to believe Republicans when they say that this offends them, because they've supported Donald Trump for the last 4 years, and it doesn't offend them. We know it doesn't because we've watched.
And considering the concept of we can just go back to normal in 2021, I think one other big story nationally, and it hit Washington very specifically, was that normal, as we might portray it, didn't really work for everyone. Specifically talking about Black Lives Matter and policing and violence on Black people in the United States. Getting back to normal isn't necessarily a good thing. That's something the Washington press, the press at large, can fall into, certainly. But that leads me to my question, 2020, so much happened. There was an impeachment trial at the beginning. The pandemic started. There was the massive reckoning over racial injustice and policing. Then an election season with virtual conventions. Then a lead up to an election that was really just every day something happened. Donald Trump tests positive for COVID-19, massive things. And here we are. There's a vaccine. You've been doing this for a while. There's so much that happened. In 10 years, when you look back on this year, what do you think is going to stay with you?
Absolutely frenetic. Just, Krishna, listening to you list all of those things and how quickly some of them have been memory hold. I mean, you mentioned Donald Trump tests positive for COVID. It's already, when I was going down the list in my mind of this year politically, that one had sort of slipped to B status. Can you imagine the president of the United States being hospitalized with the very disease that he had minimized at his age, at his weight? He could have died. And we still don't know how close he was to dying. I'm glad he didn't, and I'm glad he recovered with some treatments that aren't available, at least to most people. Gosh, I don't know, 10 years from now, two things, I guess. Certainly the pandemic. I mean, it has fundamentally changed our lives politically, economically, interpersonally, in ways that we don't understand yet. How could we? Ask me again in another 10 years on this call, and we'll look back on it maybe fondly together about some of the positive ways that life has changed, burning less gas, I guess, if we're not driving to work across America. I don't know. I think certainly the pandemic, and I think authoritarianism. I don't know where that goes. I read a lot of people smarter than I who think it gets worse before it gets better. The country's polarized, and right-wing populism is on the rise. This country won't stop changing. It won't stop getting browner. It won't stop getting more diverse. And I think white ethno-nationalism won't stop having a lot of profit for politicians who want to use that grievance among a lot of people to capitalize on their politics. So I think that's something in 10 years that you and I will have to talk about. And I hope it won't be a worse conversation before it's a better one. I suspect that it might. And maybe one of the aspects, and this is maybe my final thought, I don't want to leave it on a negative. Our politics in that way is becoming increasingly divorced from policy of any kind. Go to a Trump rally or a QAnon rally or a Trumpish, Q-ish Proud Boys rally and ask people what they think about Iraq or Afghanistan, or what they think about the highways in their part of town, or what they think about taxes or healthcare. I don't think you're going to get a lot of answers, because that's not what's bringing people to the yard. What's bringing people to the yard is straight identity in a lot of ways. I mean this largely on the right. I think it's different on the left. I think there's a ton of identity-driven politics, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, on the left as well. It's a different animal. I think on the right, people are being driven fundamentally by grievance, fundamentally by a sense of loss of primacy, fundamentally by an anger and a distrust of almost everything around them that isn't utterly familiar. And that's worrying. That's worrying to me. So I don't mean to leave it on a negative note, but I think our politics is headed in a very, very strange direction. And I think a lot of us worry about what that means in this case, for the Republican Party and the choices that they make.
Well, to spin that into the positive, one might then argue that 2020 wasn't that different from the rest of American history, where white supremacy and white ethno-nationalism was a driving factor in the course of events and how people's lives were led, what kind of policies affected them, perhaps accelerated quite a bit because of our news cycle, because of Twitter, because of everything. And maybe the positive thing about it is that we don't have to pretend it doesn't exist anymore, or that it's somehow a radical position to be like, oh yeah, white supremacy is something that guides a lot of what happens to people's lives here.
Well, look, I think it's been a minute. It's been a few decades since those things have been glaringly obvious to the population at large. I don't know, take it back to 1968 if you want. There was a lot of complacency in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s into the 2000s, at least among a lot of voters, not all voters, about the glaring racial injustices, glaring economic injustices that rage just below the surface of our politics, not of many people's lives. And it's been 2 generations. It's been a few decades since the country had to grapple with that directly. And I think we're grappling with it again. And maybe that leads to a good place.
Thanks, Todd. Hope you have a good holiday season and Happy New Year. All right, Michael Anthony Adams, I feel like I haven't seen you in months. Hope you're doing well. Big year. It's really difficult to try to sum up what happened this year, but at least seeing you, I can think of the 3 things that I remember really being impactful as a viewer and as someone catching it here in New York. Your coverage of the first days of the protests in Minneapolis during the beginnings of this year's Black Lives Matter movement. During the height of the pandemic in the Midwest, the piece that you did riding along with EMTs and first responders there. And then, a big story that on the West Coast, the fires, and how massive they were, how climate change filters into that, and how the individual stories of people trying to help their communities. So let's start, I guess, on that theme with what happened in the Midwest. When the height of COVID happening here in New York, it was starting, I believe, at that time to be getting worse in places like Detroit. What was it like out there? Why'd you go out there? What did it teach you?
So I think initially what we wanted to do was just spend time with first responders during the pandemic. You had a lot of coverage happening in the hospitals, but not a lot of eyes were on the people that were getting, the victims of COVID-19 to the hospitals. And so, we reached out to dozens of different ambulance companies to see who would let us ride along with their paramedics. Because I mean, HIPAA alone in the United States, it's hard to get camera crews into the back of an ambulance, trying to ask someone who's going through one of the most traumatic days of their life to sign in a release saying, "Hey, can I use your image on TV?" And so, we got a lot of pushback. And there was one company in Metro Detroit who said, "You know what? Our paramedics are." Going through the ringer right now. A lot of them are experiencing their own types of trauma just from what they're seeing day in, day out. We'd love for you to come and document that. So we hooked up with a crew known as MedStar, and we spent time with an EMT and a paramedic who often partner together and rode along with them for, God, it seems like, I don't know, 1-2 weeks.
It's 1 a.m. We just got a call of a man with a high-grade fever. The paramedics that we've been riding with just went inside to check this guy out. We're not sure what other symptoms he may have, but it sounds a lot like COVID.
We spent time with them, not only in the rig itself, but also at home with their families. And it was really trying to show an intimate portrait of what that was like during the height of, a global pandemic.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I remember was, for us in New York, it was very clear that something was happening. We'd hear sirens all the time. We were, pots and pans at 7 p.m. The reports from the hospitals were really something to contend with, even some of the images that came out. But there was a sort of it was hard for people maybe in other parts of the country to realize just how bad it was. And it was hard to portray what was happening in emergency rooms, what was happening with frontline responders for a couple reasons. One, the ones you were saying, people's privacy, but another, emergency responders of this type are trained to be very calm in these scenarios. So our, preconceived notion of what a global pandemic that is overwhelming a system might look like didn't necessarily match up with some of the orderly work that was happening even at places that were totally overwhelmed. So something I found really moving about the portrait of these EMTs in the Detroit area was not only did you get to see what was happening inside, but how they were responding in the way that a lot of people in trauma-adjacent jobs do, with some humor, with a kind of resiliency that might not look like trauma if you just saw it for a second, but when you really live with them, as you did for a few days, you see how it extends to their families. You see what this extraordinary moment in this country's history that happened this year affected the people who were trying to help people the most. So, I mean, first of all, thanks. I remember that moment being like, oh, yes, this is the kind of storytelling of the facts that are happening that can really portray what's going on around here.
Yeah.
What was it like for you? Because I thought your presence in that story, too, was really remarkable because there's a lot to take in.
And it was strange because that's where I grew up. That's my hometown. I grew up in Metro Detroit, and so being able to go home and tell that story, I personally connected with that because I had a lot of friends and family that were being affected by the virus and losing jobs and not being able to see family members while I was there. I mean, my whole family still lives there, and I wasn't able to see them. And, just taking those kind of precautions as well as journalists, making sure that we weren't, exacerbating the problem. But yeah, I mean, I think that I love that you recognize that in the piece, because I think one of the main things that we wanted to show is that not only was the virus, extremely deadly, but it was also instilling a lot of fear in people. And so I think especially first responders, many first responders respond to fear by, with humor and these light moments. And so, I think I think it was important to, this is a very serious subject, but it was important to inject some of those lighter moments into the piece to let people know that this is, it's a job that takes a toll on you physically, it takes a toll on you mentally. And so we have to make sure that, we're not, succumbing to like these mental health issues that might stem from seeing this kind of trauma day in and day out. It was strange because I think one of the biggest fears that Kelly, the EMT in the partnership of the EMT and paramedic, she said she had trained for everything. She is deployed to hurricanes around the United States. She's part of the sheriff's unit SWAT team. So she is not only is she an EMT, but she's also deputized by the sheriff's department to go in and treat gunshot wounds that officers might receive if they're in a gun battle or something like that. And so, she has all this high level training, but she said one thing that they never trained her for was bringing something home to her wife. And so she would come home each day terrified, not only for her safety, but for her wife's safety. I mean, her wife doesn't spend time with her out in the field, but, what this virus did was, it would attach to people and then it brought it home. And that was something that was extremely, extremely scary for her. And she had plans in place. She had put an RV in her backyard, and if she would test positive, that's where she would go. Ultimately, though, her wife, said that she'd never let her go out there alone. Same thing. If my wife were to catch it, I wouldn't let her be alone either. So I don't know. I felt for her in that moment, and so it was kind of those human portraits that we really wanted to capture alongside the story about a virus that was wreaking havoc in Detroit at the time.
Another huge story of the year that you were right in the middle of was the killing of George Floyd, the protests that happened afterwards, the beginning of what was a nationwide movement of reckoning about police violence and injustice towards Black people. Of course, what sticks with me is, one of those first nights, you yourself were tear gassed. You and your crew, you and Roberto Daza, I've worked with him for a while too.
Yeah.
That was tough for me to watch. I know we don't want to kind of bring these stories, they're not about us, but that was a moment where a lot of American citizens were on the street saying police violence is unacceptable. And as you can attest, police violence was in some ways the response.
I am pressed. Okay, I'm down. I am pressed. Please.
What were those moments like? What was it like living through that time? Because again, so much happened this year that those early days when that was happening, we might forget just how jagged edged the whole country felt. What was it like for you on the ground?
It was strange because, we had multiple teams in Minneapolis at the time. Alzo was there with a team, and, they were put down on the ground. They were actually arrested and thrown in the back of a police van and taken and nearly booked. So it was strange to see the way that the press as a whole were being treated. For us, I think in that moment with our team, we had gone to cover the protest, but to also look at one specific family. So it was going to be a portrait of this family whose business had already been raided twice by looters. And so they were standing guard to make sure that nothing else happened to the business. I mean, everything in the business was gone, but they didn't want the whole building to burn like, we had seen other businesses in Minneapolis do. And so, I think it caught me off guard, when we were on private property with a family. As journalists, we had the permission to be out past curfew, and yet still, without any notice, without any warning, vans pulled up. And it was something that I would expect to see in other parts of the world, but not in the U.S. It's not the response that I was expecting. And Daza, Roberto Daza and Amel, they both have been in some of the worst situations in the most dangerous parts of the world, and it caught both of them by surprise, being pepper sprayed in the face, told to get on the ground, having guns pointed in their face. I mean, you expect that in other parts of the world. It's unfortunate that you do, but you do. here in the United States, I don't think that we've seen it to this level until the death of George Floyd.
And it was, well, we know that will be something that we'll remember about 2020, is that reawakening of a civil rights movement, one of the largest social movements ever to happen in this country. I want to shift to this third story that I remember, the fires in California, how massive, devastating they were, how there is certainly some relationship to climate change. Take me through what that was like for you, and like what you'll remember from covering that.
So before I came to Vice, I mean, a large part of my career I had spent covering fires, and so going back to California.
This is your first year with us here at Vice, is that right?
Yeah. So this is my first year at Vice was actually quite.
You picked a hell of a year.
Yeah, hell of a year to start. But I'm glad that I was able to be a part of the stories that really defined not only our country but the entire world. And so it meant a lot to be able to share those stories with people. I think the fires was, it's one of those stories to like go back and to spend time with a group of elite firefighters that I had known in a previous job, and being able to reconnect with them and see how a pandemic, was affecting their jobs and what they did. And to be honest, there was this global pandemic happening, but when it comes to fires, I mean, you have to fight the fire, and you can't, there's only so much you can do until, that has to be put by the wayside, and you're able to actually do the job in front of you, which is, to stop some of the deadliest and largest wildfires California's ever seen. And so being back out there, camping out with them at night, that was something that was pretty incredible. To see these ladies and these guys are out there for 16, 17 days at a time. They're working 16 to 17, 18-hour shifts. They're sleeping on the ground every night. They're not showering for days at a time. When they do go home to their families, it's usually for only 48 hours until they're back onto their next deployment. And these fires are becoming more unpredictable. Climate change certainly, is a part of that, but it also has to do with people are building in areas of our national forest that they once weren't living. And so it's interesting to see how, there is a human side to this, and they are doing whatever they can, to keep people safe. And it's quite a sacrifice.
Sure. And then the encroachment of humans onto natural wilderness might even be related to the pandemic itself as it first started to spread. Thank you, Michael, for all the work this year. Liz Landers, I remember very early this year, one of the first times that we did kind of like a remote crosstalk with each other, back before the pandemic, actually, I referred to you as my pen pal, because we would correspond so often, and like it was like we were having this long distance friendship, and a very informative friendship, because you've been reporting all year tirelessly throughout the country about both the politics and the election as we know it, but the big issues that are behind it. 2020 obviously was a wild year, one we'll remember forever, I think. What do you think will stick with you? What are the reporting that you've done, what you've seen, what you've heard, both on like a individual story level, but on sort of macro trends level as well? Like what happened?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's been great to talk remotely. I don't think we've ever met in person. I've been reflecting on it. It's so crazy, but I have had such interesting, smart conversations with you. So I think 2020, at least I've gotten smarter by being on this show and interacting with our host and correspondents. So thank you. There has been a ton. I mean, I covered the 2016 elections as an embedded reporter and thought that that was the biggest story of my life, seeing Donald Trump unexpectedly win the White House. And I think 2020 has put all of that kind of reporting to shame, because we've seen so many unprecedented moments here, starting with the pandemic and all of the ways that it's been politicized here in DC. Unfortunately, we saw a huge and monumental protest movement that Vice covered from the ground. And I was very proud to cover for us here in DC, the BLM protests and fight for racial equality here and across the country. And then the election happened on top of all of that. There was a big presidential election, and then there were also down ballot elections that mattered a lot too. One of the things that I have been reflecting on in this last year, and one of the things that I'm grateful for our ability to get out into the field despite the pandemic, and we took the risk to do that, but I think it was worth it to talk to Americans in such a critical moment. And one of those things was really the way that the political parties in this country, I think, are seeing a realignment. And I did that story back in September that we had on the show about miners in Minnesota. And there's a part of the Iron Range there in northern Minnesota where a lot of working class union guys who work in mines there, basically for iron, have been sort of saying for the last 4 years that they felt like the Democratic Party left them behind. And I think that we saw some of that in 2016, and it was kind of a mythical, like, a white man in a diner thing. But I think that trend actually did continue into 2020. And I think that the political parties that Republicans and Democrats on the Hill and in DC might identify with are actually not a lot of the voters that we see now going to events. I think that Biden had a lot of support, ended up having a lot of support from young people and people of color that really turned out and gave him that win for the presidential election. But I also think that the Democrats have lost some of these people and continue to lose these voters, right? Like, it's not just that it happened in 2016 and that was a fluke. I think there are people in this country that feel like the political party that they were with before doesn't really represent them anymore. And I think there are also people that left the Republican Party too, people that really felt like it became the party of Trump. And I talked with Biden supporters who were former Trump supporters who said, no more, we can't handle this. But I think that we're going to continue to see this sort of political realignment with the parties. And I think both parties are going to have to grapple with this, especially now with Trump leaving the White House. I'm very curious to see how the Republican Party either changes their tone and their messaging or doesn't.
Well, break that down for me. If there's been a realignment of the parties who they represent, I suppose, whose interests they represent, or which voters gravitate towards each party. What was it like before, and what is it kind of trending to now?
Yeah, I think you had sort of more people who felt like the Republican Party was the party of wealthier Americans, people that had 401ks, which is something that Trump always talks about, people that had investments, stock. And I think that the Democrats felt like they really connected with working class voters. And I think that the more I was out on the campaign trail, and I think it also had to do with some of the places that we were visiting, because we specifically were looking to talk with voters who were part of this realignment. But I just felt like there were voters over and over again that you show up somewhere and you have a preconceived notion maybe sometimes of what the interview is going to sound like and what people are going to say and what you're going to hear. And it ends up being totally different. I certainly a lot by getting out there and talking with these people. And I think the respective political parties probably should watch our show, because I think they might learn some things.
Yeah, and I think the Iron Range story was of particular interest to me because the concept of a union and the Democratic Party's longstanding relationship with unions was something that held that coalition together. That seems to be dissolving quite a bit, both because maybe unions aren't quite as strong politically, but also, as you saw on an individual level, people don't seem to think the Democrats have their interests in mind. On the other side, the Republican Party doesn't seem particularly attuned to the racial realities that people everywhere in the United States are testifying to in their lives, on the streets, in other ways. Take me through what it was like covering the Black Lives Matter movement the way that you did, what stuck with you there, and how that might, reflect upon that realignment of parties that you were talking about.
I think obviously the BLM protests this summer started with the death of George Floyd, but I think politically speaking here in DC, the moment that I think catalyzed a lot of the activism here and frankly the reaction from Democrats on the Hill to get something done was when Trump went outside of the White House and held up the Bible. And there was just this extraordinary moment where you were seeing thousands of people. And I was right outside the White House because I live nearby and had left the area right before that happened, which was smart because I did not have the right kind of protection to be out on the street for something like that. But it was 6 p.m. It was still light outside. Nobody was being violent. And to see that moment, and I think that catalyzed what we saw in DC here with the reaction from Democrats to say, okay, we are crafting legislation and we are going to try to do something to end this policing malfeasance that we've seen across the country. And watching the political process play out here in DC, which was really helmed by the Democrats in the House, because they have the majority there, they were actually able to put together a bill, which they named in honor of George Floyd. His brother, Philanese, came to DC and testified about policing in America and how it has affected their families' lives, and also thousands of other Black families and brown families across this country. And one of the, politics is always you wait for something to happen, and sometimes it takes a while. In this case, that was pretty immediate.
I'll bring you back to 2020 on that point, just for one more question. I'm remembering back in the primaries, which happened this year as well, when it became crystallized in the Democratic Party after South Carolina that Joe Biden was going to be the nominee. Up to that point, it was rather contentious, and Senator Sanders had a lot of support, especially among younger people. And you've had history covering the Sanders campaign. I think back in 2016. I'm not if I'm getting that right.
Yeah.
You were there. There was that. I remember from a generational point of view, a big letdown for a lot of young progressives to think, we've got not someone who's been around, but who hasn't necessarily always been on the right side of these civil rights issues. Biden administration, Joe Biden is going to be president because of African American voters, maybe even African American women specifically. I don't even have a question really. I mean, my concept here is the Democratic Party itself is shifting too, not just the Republican Party. Sort of older guard Democrat in charge. There's a lot of energy on the progressive side. A lot of people maybe held their noses and voted for him, organized for him. Going forward, what do you think the dynamics of the Democratic Party are going to be given what happened this year in 2021, or this year in 2020?
I wish it was 2021. Give me the vaccine. I think you're 100% right with that. And I think that the Democratic Party is recognizing that, right? And I think, frankly, that Stacey Abrams really opened everybody's eyes to the fact that her organizing in Georgia and her organization, Fair Fight, helped deliver Georgia for Joe Biden, for the Democrats. She's a Black woman living in the South, and she was able to harness her platform basically to help him win there. I do think you've seen Biden also acknowledge that South Carolina put him over the edge as well. But I think that these cabinet picks that we're seeing currently from Biden and the people that he is surrounding himself with in his future White House are speaking to this exactly. There's been a lot of pressure that outside groups have been making to get a diverse slate of people in there. And it's working, frankly. Right now, we have seen a number of historic picks, like we're seeing the first Black man who's going to head up the Environmental Protection Agency. That matters because there's a lot of environmental disparities and, frankly, racism in where people live and what their actual environment looks like around them. That's a big deal. We've also seen Congresswoman Deb Haaland, who's going to be the Interior Secretary. She's a Native American woman heading up an agency that looks over the lands in this country. So all of this pressure and all of the different groups that came together and the coalition, which it's not the Obama coalition, it's the Biden coalition that helped deliver his win for the presidency, I think is going to be reflected in his cabinet and the way that this White House looks. And frankly, it's a lot more diverse than the Trump White House currently is.
Yeah, and Native Americans in Arizona helped carry that state. Of course, Stacey Abrams is organizing in Georgia. Liz, we could have talked for hours, I imagine, about this year. We didn't even get to some of the stuff we thought we'd talk about, like Republican women winning at the congressional level. But there will be another year, and there will certainly be politics, and D.C. goes on. So have a great holidays and have a good New Year, and I'll see you probably on air next time on Jan 4 and 5.
In person. No, thank you so much. Happy New Year's. It's been great working alongside you and reporting. And hopefully we'll meet in 2021 after we get vaccinated.
Sounds good to me. Take care, Liz. Roberto Ferdman, it's nice to see you. Back in office times, we used to sit across from each other, so this feels like a blast from the past. One thing that I remember very clearly about our conversations and like just our back and forth when we were in the same office was you are very good at digging in on something, and maybe a bit of an obsessive, I could say, in a complimentary sort of way. And this year, a lot of the work that you did revolved around one story. And it was a story that articulates something broader and much bigger, a bigger story that happened this year in the United States. Black Lives Matter, police violence towards Black people, accountability, and the reckoning that we've had. But the case of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, the Louisville Metro PD, this was a big focus of yours. And you broke a lot of stories. You were able to put it in perspective in ways that I don't think I'd seen before. And frankly, I learned a lot. What was it like focusing on this case? Why was it something that you just had to keep digging on? And what do you think it tells us about the broader themes of what 2020 was like and how 2020 perhaps was a watershed moment in the history of the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years?
Well, first of all, I do love digging into things, but I would say that people don't hear about all the dead ends. Plenty of dead ends. Digging into this particular story this year was surreal. I mean, it was this story and really the kind of national, let's call it like a reawakening about the persistence of police brutality, of systemic racism in our policing system, and the ways in which specific populations, Black Americans in particular, feel like they aren't afforded the same, justice system, the same treatment as others. This hit at kind of the peak of paranoia about the pandemic. This happened in May. I was in my apartment for the previous 2.5 months, barely even leaving, and suddenly I find myself in Louisville with a few colleagues covering protests, learning about this case, learning that most of the information that should have been available about what happened on the night that Breonna Taylor was killed during this police raid was not in the public's hands, was not given to the public. So we're there covering this movement, but also learning about this story and realizing that most of it is in the shadows still. And I think that that's the first thing that intrigued us. It's the lack of public information, and in a kind of, if you're not the sort of person who likes a good dare, maybe journalism isn't for you. So the fact that information was being kept from the public, that it was going to be hard to find, I think that egged us on. And over the course of the following 6 months, 7 months, I guess we're about 7 or 8 months from them now, we learned that there was a reason why a lot of this information was being kept, and that a lot of it was, being willfully hid from the public. We filed FOIAs, for open records, and were kind of given the runaround, told they didn't have things, told that because of the ongoing investigation, they weren't releasing information. So we had to find back channels. And, I think that it really tested our ability to like persist on a story. But I also think that it challenged us to not take a narrative that's put forth by a city or a police department at face value, because of what we learned in the aftermath. And if there's anything that people learn about the movement this year, or at least the awareness about systemic racism in policing in the United States, I hope that it's that, because we've seen this in several different instances. In fact, very, very recently, we've seen it in a few other prominent cases. One in Chicago, where we just learned that the narrative isn't exactly as the police department put forth. So I'd say surreal is how I would describe it, and it was eye-opening for me and all of my colleagues.
In a sense, it was a case study in the larger abuse of power, perhaps, that police departments around the country have potentially been engaging in, as far as telling a story that doesn't necessarily match up to the facts, withholding facts to support the story that they want, and that goes to qualified immunity. These other ideas about how to attend to this problem. But the most immediate way of attending to that problem is through either firing these police officers or holding them to account with criminal charges. What was it like to be there because this was a case where there were some charges filed, but not really anyone was happy with them?
I mean, the narrative kind of gets away on both ends. And what I mean by that is there's a whole contingent of folks who are very quick to go out and defend the police or police officers in any given situation. Take the police department's word at or account at face value. But then there are also folks on the other side who either jump to conclusions about, say, how malicious the intentions were on the part of the officers, or they allow rumors that popped up at the beginning to persist. And in this case, that's just true. Even to this day, there are people who say that Breonna Taylor was killed in her sleep, which we know is not true. But I think that ends up snowballing, especially when you compound that with frustration that's existed with this system that does not hold, there's so many examples, does not hold police officers accountable in the way that it holds regular citizens accountable. And the demands on the justice system were enormous. People wanted all of the officers to be charged. They wanted things to happen that, given the system that we work in or are working with, are very difficult. So I anticipated some of the frustration, but that's not to say that people should necessarily feel okay with the outcome. I think that it's this series of moving the ball, or moving the posts further and further in a direction. And I believe that happened over the course of the summer, and even through the course of the investigation of this case, to hold police more accountable. At this moment, a handful of police officers within the department that were part of this raid are being investigated internally for policy violations. The FBI is conducting a separate investigation that's going to conclude sometime next year, and is, from everything we've been led to understand, way more far-reaching, or much further reaching than the investigation that was overseen by Kentucky's Attorney General. So I mean, in some ways, I kind of split it down the middle there and said that people both have a right to feel frustrated, but also I think that some folks got out ahead of themselves, and in doing so, maybe didn't appreciate the progress that they made, and the difference that I think that a lot of their work made, and them means, you know, prosecutors, attorneys, folks who work just within in awareness in this space, you know, the people who are out in the streets, and journalists. You know, we're not the only ones who uncovered information about this case. There was a lot of, you know, really impressive work done by local journalists in Louisville, by the Courier Journal, by WDRB. So yeah, I think it was humbling for everybody, but hopefully it was empowering as well.
Yeah, I mean, and from the number of police officers wearing body cam on that night to what the grand jury was ultimately presented by the AG, like, inconsistencies were consistent throughout the presentation of public knowledge. And I think were it not for efforts of you and your team, of other journalists around the country, like, we might still be left with those official accounts that weren't accounting for everything that happened. So, I mean, basically, like, thanks for digging in. You know, and I think about this year and the reawakening, as you said, of calls for justice and social justice. Say her name, Breonna Taylor, is something we're going to remember. How are you going to remember it?
Oh man. I'm going to remember, you know, there are so many times in this job, you go to a place and you meet people whose stories are impactful and who really need someone's help. And that might be someone's help uncovering something, that might be someone's help just, you know, listening. And you tell them almost without fail, you know, I'm coming back. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to investigate this. I'm going to look into this. But a lot of the time you're not able to actually make good on that word. No matter how, you know, how genuine you were in saying that to the person. And this was one of those few instances, or one of those instances in which I felt like we went there, we told her family, Breonna Taylor's family, we told folks in Louisville that we were committed to figuring out what the truth is, to getting the city of Louisville, the folks out in the street, Breonna Taylor's family, the transparency that, you know, I think most adults deserve, most tax-paying citizens deserve in a city with their police department. And we went back over and over again, and I think that we made good on our word. So I'm very proud of not just my work. I mean, it was the result of so many you know, people at Vice News and the team who dedicated immense amounts of time and took, I don't even know how many risks to do this. That's how I'm going to remember Say Her Name and this summer and the work that we did on this story.
I was from combing through hundreds of hours of footage in the internal investigation. That was through. I mean, I'll remember that interview you had with her sister as a really human piece of journalism that I thank you for, and I thank the whole team for. So have a great rest of the year. Hope you can rest up, and 2021 will probably be pretty busy too. Mina Durison, you did a lot of reporting this year. It's been a long one. And I think if we were to think about a word of the year, exacerbate might be one of them, as far as the way that COVID-19 exacerbated problems that were already apparent. And one area of expertise that I think you've developed this year is about education, because as we all of us who have kids know, school was super disruptive. Yeah. Even if thinking about those first couple weeks of the pandemic when, like, college kids were just sent home. And, you know, you were there. You were reporting on that. What'd you learn? Take me through all that.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, this felt like a short-term problem, and I think people were talking about things that were a couple weeks, a couple months. So, you brought up college kids. In the beginning, all these college kids were sent home, and they were panicking because, they had spent money for an education that was not really the type of experience that they were expecting. So, in the beginning, one of the first stories I did, this is my first year here at Vice, so one of the first stories I did here was about all these students who were filing these lawsuits around the country against colleges for money that they felt like they had paid and they should be getting back. And, in the beginning, that felt like, oh, that might be one of the biggest problems this year is like, will this shake up higher education forever? Will, these elite institutions that are charging these insane amounts of money, will people still want to pay that if it's clear that you can like just get education on Zoom? So those were like the early conversations and problems. And people were saying like, this could lead to the collapse of many parts of higher education as we know it. Will this lead to sort of like this big boom for community colleges, and will people just stop paying for the higher end? And are people really just paying for like networking and stuff like that? So those were sort of the early concerns. And then, as it became clear that this crisis was going to continue, then you started hearing, obviously parents, of little kids. I have 2 little kids at home. I think anyone who's been dealing with that is just been submerged in this kind of additional nightmare. So that was a whole conversation about like, what's going to happen to these little kids? So there's like the big kids being impacted, little kids who are like, the experts are saying this is the lost year, they're going to have all these long-term, to your point, like problems will be exacerbated, for kids who maybe didn't have the means coming in. So there were all these issues like across the spectrum for students. And then also, as this pandemic continued, we just saw like larger and larger ripple effects. So now you're talking about like kids, their families, the institutions, potentially the whole landscape of higher education, the towns these students are living in, like what's going to happen to like all of these communities, just larger and larger. And it, what started as a story that I think sort of had like kind of niche appeal, either you're a student or a student, suddenly it was like, oh, this is going to touch every kind of facet, of our lives, this sort of domino effect of what happens when the schools close.
Yeah. I have a 6-year-old who is at home learning, and it's hard. Luckily, we're able to be around. We have pretty good Wi-Fi, as you can see. We have the means to be able to like put some attention towards it, even if not as much as he might get at school. But let's dig in on that exacerbation thing, because like you saw, I'll be honest, like there's part of this year that has been really special as a parent, which is I've seen more of my kid than I ever have. Like I would be on the road half the time, he would be at school. And that is a precious thing that I think I'll remember. But that's an immense amount of privilege that I'm speaking from, because that's just the case. What did you see in your reporting upon people faced with scenarios that aren't quite as Wi-Fi ready or as accessible to the education that one might get? And maybe not even just the education, but the social services and otherwise that schools, public schools as an institution provide.
Well, I will say the first thing that I was surprised by, and maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but what you just said about this sort of special time, that is actually a sentiment that you hear from parents across the socioeconomic spectrum. People recognize that this is kind of a unique, special time, and every parent I spoke to, regardless of their means or their stress level, was thankful that they were able to hang out with their kids more, see their kids more. So that was kind of special. The problems, though, that are facing the different groups of people, to your point, of those who have, Wi-Fi, easy access to things versus those who don't, they manifest in these interesting ways. So on the one hand, many families I spoke to were just a little more accepting of the situation than I was expecting. Like there was not as much anger as I was anticipating among families who do not have the means and the access to things that other families do. So even though you're speaking to families who are living in housing projects, who are on social assistance, who have to juggle full-time jobs, multiple kids doing remote schooling, a lot of these parents were saying, oh yeah, we know that this is how it has to work. And they were frankly really concerned with their kids' safety of sending them back into these schools before they were ready. So there's like a lot of really complicated conversations here. Like experts were saying, we're really worried about the kids who don't have the family support, who don't have the infrastructure, who don't have, the parents who have the income to hire a tutor, to hire a teacher, to bring in somebody else, so they're just planting their kids in front of TVs or screens or whatever to get them through the day. But the parents who are on the ground experiencing these situations really were kind of grasping for like how to feel about it. There was not one clear feeling of like, we're being left behind, this is so unfair. And I think what was interesting is one of the activists I spoke to out of Oakland, California, was saying, these families, these underprivileged families have been failed by the system for a long time. So like for them, it's not new, like this pandemic situation where suddenly the whole country is talking about inequality. It's like they know that. They've been experiencing that for a long time. So yes, it's exacerbating these situations, but she was kind of hopeful that maybe this extra spotlight, extra attention, potentially extra funding would lead to solutions that could be created for these communities that would potentially last beyond the pandemic. But I think everyone who studies education and who studies child development, those people were very concerned about what's happening and the fact that some parents are going to be able to set up their kids for something much better, to not fall behind in reading, these kind of like fundamental things you learn in school that you really need to be in person for. And honestly, the parents who were not that concerned, I think what the activists and experts told me is like, that's also kind of a red flag that they don't even have the experience to know sort of what they're missing out on, that these families in other places are setting up these sort of much more advantageous infrastructures for their kids. And meanwhile, these families who have been told, okay, here's your remote learning plan, and you have to now you have to look for a job at night because you're going to be at home taking care of your kids during the day. Those families were like just putting their heads down and like struggling through it and not even necessarily aware of the help that they were not having access to. So it's a really complicated, nuanced conversation, which surprised me.
Yeah, and then, speaking of complicated, I think another story that really stuck out to me was that land grant institution out west, a higher education institution, that the town around it was built around the school. And so when those kids were no longer in person, that meant coffee shops had to improvise. Mm-hmm. That meant all these different businesses that kind of were dependent in some ways upon the economic activity provided by students no longer existed. That was a really interesting look into higher ed, but basically it's like what public services are and how they do things, is pretty cool. I mean, not cool in the sense of the struggle, but cool, like it shows something about when there are institutions and resources, it can double on effect.
Yeah, and these communities are sort of interwoven and they don't even necessarily realize like how dependent they are on each other. But, for that town, if football is moved to the spring or indefinitely, then all the businesses that make money on football weekends are in jeopardy. If students aren't coming, if their parents aren't coming to visit them, then like restaurants, hotels, really basic kind of, businesses that lift up a community during the regular school year, suddenly all of the access to that is gone. But again, complicated because the communities in which students did come back in full force saw the COVID numbers go way up. So it's like, then you have people in those towns who are saying like, we don't actually want these college students back. So it's really messy. The whole year was very messy. And I think these higher ed conversations, for that school is a regional university. It's serving, lower income families, serving a lot of minorities. That's a really not diverse area racially and socioeconomically. And that's one of the only places that brings that diversity to that area. That's another thing that goes by the wayside. If that school, people who were there were saying this school might not last in 5 years. This school might not be here. Institutions like this around the country, experts told us, are the highest risk of collapsing because of the pandemic, because they're a little too expensive to be like a community college. So when people are cutting their budgets, they're not going to shell out, but they don't have the reputation of like a Harvard. So suddenly it's not worth it for these families to send their kids there. So then you're eliminating potentially a tier of educational opportunity for minorities, for people who come from lower income families. So that's another like side effect of the pandemic, like could wipe out a whole tier of access to education for, all these populations. So it's just like bizarre the amount of wrinkles, this thing has.
Yeah. Well, I guess the lesson is just how interconnected everything is. And that maybe that's a lesson from 2020 that we can hopefully take away. Thank you, Mina, for the work this year. I hope you can get some rest. Greg Walters, it's good to see you. It's been a busy year in D.C. I'm almost I almost can't remember what happened this year, but you've been living and investigating and filing really great stories about all things Trump universe, the Trump world itself. Let's start with what happened at the beginning of the year, a little thing called impeachment. There were articles that happened. There was a trial, right? Did it matter?
Well, the short answer is no. It didn't matter. And to me, that was one of the big lessons of the Trump era, is that sometimes it can feel like you're living through really momentous historic events, and you're just not. The impeachment was ultimately a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. It would have been perhaps the major historical event of some other president's career, but, it happened almost exactly a year ago. The impeachment started. He got impeached by the House. And then in January, and they started hashing out the actual trial in the Senate. And then we just forgot about it. I mean, it happened last year. It feels like it happened last century.
Did the cloud of those articles of, the historic, I mean, he's the third person? I don't even know the numbers, but there's not many presidents get impeached. Even fewer, I suppose, get removed. But did that, it feels like it didn't affect the campaign at all. It didn't affect much of anything at all. Like, how does that square with the other things that happened in Trump universe, given this was such a significant year, given there's so many, conflict of interest, there's so many, palace intrigue backstabbings, or so many books by, either former staffers or even relatives. You have a particular insight, I think, into this presidency, especially this year in this presidency. What's going to stick with you?
Well, for Trump, it's interesting. For Trump, for any other president, you would think that getting impeached would mark a key moment in their presidency. For Trump, it probably wasn't even the most interesting thing that happened this year. And I would draw a parallel with the Mueller investigation, in the sense that in the moment, it felt all-consuming. And then it didn't take very long before it felt like it happened years ago. And there's been this weird phenomenon with a lot of reporters in Washington, D.C., with a lot of people who are following politics really closely, where time feels like it's become a slinky. Trump has this, I don't know if you'd call it genius or madness, but this ability to just flood the zone with events and scandal and chaos, and he overloads the system. And I don't know if it's a deliberate strategy or just the way this guy is, but he creates so much scandal that reporters have a hard time keeping up with it. And I think that one of the lessons of the Trump era may be that under the right circumstances, it's easier to survive 10,000 scandals than it is to survive just one. If everyone can just focus on her emails, for example, the defining Hillary Clinton campaign scandal, it's one thing that everyone can remember. But if you have impeachment, and then Trump caught COVID, and then Trump ignored the pandemic, and then, and on and on and on and on, who can keep track?
In a sense, he hacked the system of accountability by way, the press can cover everything that happens, but since there's so much, it kind of all falls away. You can only get so wet, I suppose. The one piece that I think I'll remember that you did this year was about the Trump universe itself. You kind of dressed up as if you were Carl Sagan, and take me through that piece, what you learned in sort of putting it together, and what this year and this presidency is going to stick with you after learning all that stuff.
Right. Well, that piece was the crime galaxy. So many people orbiting around Trump have been charged with crimes or investigated for crimes that it was hard to keep track. And so in a way, it was a reflection of this phenomenon that we just talked about, which was there is so much of this, it's hard to keep track. So this sort of began as a way of mentally getting our heads around the orbiting rings of criminality in the Trump universe, and how the governing force in this universe so often appears to be greed. It's greed that pulls and so many of these orbiting bodies towards the very center. And towards a center where you have a lot of self-dealing and a lot of questions about Trump enriching himself in office, a lot of lingering questions about his finances and his tax returns and whether he broke the law himself, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have all of these other people that he brought with him, like Michael Cohen and Steve Bannon and Roger Stone and Michael Flynn and on, who just end up having all these criminal problems. And it seems to be more like a feature rather than a bug of the Trump universe. But again, you have this question of when someone is so covered in scandal, it almost stops to be a scandal and becomes more like just a personality trait. You know, it begins to kind of diffuse and stop being something that you can focus on, and is more just like an aspect of his personality.
Another thing you did this year was read a lot of books and memoir, et cetera, of people who were in that universe, or who are still in that universe, I suppose. And you did it in your yard, and it was like you were at the beach, but we couldn't go anywhere because, quarantine and all. What did you learn from those books? What would you take away?
A fair amount. There was this period over the summer before the election when everyone who's ever been anywhere near Trump decided to publish a book. And our reaction to that was to do the Beach Read series, where the running gag was, we're doing it from the backyard because you can't get to the beach. So I have to say that having plowed through a big stack of books about Trump, there are two that really stuck with me. One was by his niece, Mary Trump, who I think offered a pretty powerful analysis of his personality. She's got a PhD in clinical psychology, and she sort of broke down what it is that she thinks makes him psychologically interesting, shall we say? Let's put it that way. And then the other one was by his longtime attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen. These are two people who knew him a long time before he became the president. And coincidentally, they are two people who both predicted that he would not admit defeat in the election. And so far, they've been right. And both of them told me after that they think he really believes that the election was stolen from him. That, as Mary Trump put it to me, she said he's the only person she knows who can gaslight himself.
Wow.
So she thinks that essentially he has drunk his own Kool-Aid and really thinks it's true, which is interesting. And Michael Cohen agrees.
So that's counter he's a sociopathic liar who will do anything, including lie constantly for power. If he's embodying a kind of truth, then that's a different way of thinking about it.
It is. You could argue that it's kind of academic at the end of the day, except that Michael Cohen would argue, and I think Mary Trump would argue, that if he really believes it, it makes it easier for him to convince other people because it's not a total charade. He really thinks this is true. And so if you buy that argument, then perhaps that helps explain why he's managed to bring so many Republican voters along with him. The statistics are that at this point, most Republican voters think that Trump should have been the rightful winner. And perhaps he is more able to convince people because he maybe really thinks it's true. This all gets into very speculative territory and attempting to read the mind of the president, who is constantly saying things that aren't true and sort of acting very weird. And it's dicey territory here, right? And Mary Trump herself is actually careful not to give a full diagnosis of the president because she says he is, in a sense, in the West Wing, institutionalized, as she put it. But so you would need to have a team of experts really asking him questions up close, engaging his reactions, and et cetera, to really have a firm psychoanalytic judgment on the president. But in any case, the point is that these are people who know him well, and this is what they say, and this is what they told me, and draw your own conclusions.
So that brings me, I think, to a couple things. The first thing I think about is yes, it's speculative insofar as we don't know what's going on inside the brain of the president. But we do know that as journalists and as people who are trying to hold power to account, but also understand what's happening in the world today, it's been very difficult to have to sort of fuse together a imagined reality that is broadcast to many, many people, and many believe it, that is not grounded in truth, with things that we know through reporting and through science and through all these other institutional ways of understanding what is real together, by way of saying this might be false, but this might be real. It's a very difficult scenario for all of us, and maybe that'll continue in the future. Maybe it was just something that happened in 2020 because of this pandemic, because of this president, because of this election. But going forward, what lessons do you think you learned about how to approach covering events when the nature of those events, as far as their relationship to truth, are in dispute, even though they shouldn't be?
Well, way to hand me an easy question here at the year-end interview, Krishna. But I don't think I'm
honestly wondering.
This is a really important question, and I don't fully know how to answer it. But here's what I would suggest. I think that there is a long-standing tradition in American Western journalism of trying to both sides a lot of issues, to say, well, we have a conflict here. Here's what one side says. In fairness, here's what the other side says. And then the press can say, boom, boom, we've covered this. We've done our fair job. I think that it becomes much more difficult to take that approach when you have issues where, for example, one side may not be approaching it with good faith, or is saying things that are objectively false, such as when President Trump says that there is evidence that the election was stolen from him. That is not true. So there are a few tools that you do have as a journalist in your toolkit to try to approach that problem. One is to just state the facts, return to basics. When somebody says something that's not true, up in the top of your article, if you're covering what just happened, state that's not true. Beyond that, I think that another approach that I have used this year is to come at the news with a little bit of a slightly less traditional approach. When we talked about doing the beach reads in the backyard, or when we made the crime cosmos of Trump's friends and allies who keep getting indicted with things, we're approaching it in a slightly, with a slightly humorous, slightly satirical approach. And I think that is a less straight ahead, we're reading the news on ABC in 1964 with a very straight face and no humor at all. I think that's a slightly different approach on the news that hopefully gets around some of these issues by approaching it and saying, look, we both know what's really going on. Here's another way to think about it. Here's another way to look at it. So, these are huge questions that I think all of the press is grappling with. But these are the best answers I've got.
What do you think is going to stick with you when you look back on 2020? All the stuff you've done, all the stuff that's happened. I think hopefully we'll all have a bit of a palate cleanse over the holidays, and the new year will happen, and we can do what we do. Some things are going to stick. Some things are going to go away, like the impeachment, for instance. Where did that go? What's going to stick with you? What did you learn?
Well, I think the main guiding principle of the work that I've been doing for the past year or two or three, or time is a slinky, I don't know how long anymore, but has been documenting Trump's legal problems, right? That's been the key question. And, when I have conversations with experts on the Constitution who are professors who are teaching these subjects, they are having a ball because they're saying that Trump has raised all these questions that either there's no constitutional or legal answer for, such as, can the president pardon himself, that are going to be settled somehow, maybe by his presidency, perhaps. So I have talked to professors who are teaching entire courses on the Constitution based on just trying to understand whether what Trump has done is constitutional or legal. But I think the thing that really jumps out at me is that I think the Trump era has been a massive stress test on the American system. He has been testing the election since early November or before. Let's circle back to the first question we talked about, which was impeachment. what did Trump get impeached for? He got impeached for asking Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden's son, to launch an investigation of Joe Biden's son. So if you step back from Trump's efforts to have his opponent's son investigated, which was interesting. I mean, he went a long way to doing that, right? He really tried to get Joe Biden's son investigated by Ukraine, or at least get them to announce an investigation. And it didn't work. Ukraine did not announce an investigation. Trump got impeached. He didn't get removed from office. His presidency sort of continued awkwardly after that. We just sort of walked it off, and it felt like it was decades ago. And then after the election, we learned that there was already an investigation of Joe Biden's son, Hunter, and his tax issues being carried on by the prosecutor in Delaware. There was an investigation under his nose, and Trump went around the world to get one. So I think that the thing that I am continuing to think about is how the American system is processing the Trump presidency, and which of the pillars of our democracy and our legal system he has managed to wobble or outright knock down, and which ones have withstood his ability to actually push them over somehow. And, I think that, at least so far, he has not managed to convince, any prosecutor to lock up Hunter Biden or his predecessor. And that didn't really work, despite having a very pliant attorney general in William Barr. So, I think that the thing that I think about a lot and will continue thinking about is this really interesting which parts of the American system Trump sort of trammeled over with his unorthodox behavior and which ones he wasn't able to.
Right. So which of the norms that kind of held things together need to be codified into something in order for the system to keep itself functioning, and which ones were resilient enough? I guess stress tests are good to some degree for testing things, but at the other side of it, it was a real open question. Perhaps it still is, early days yet. It still hasn't happened, when you think about it. But it was an open question, I think, for much of this year as to whether the American system was resilient enough to withstand the authoritarian impulses and ways that this president used every lever he could find to. He would never say, "Oh, I'm hemmed in by this." Never seems to have, never has, maybe never will. So my question to you is, that's the final one, right? If indeed he potentially is going to be under multiple criminal investigations upon leaving office, he's got a couple more weeks left. Like, what do you think about the concept of pardoning himself? And would it even work?
So, I think that one of the institutions that so far, knock on wood, has held up in the Trump era is the court system. It worked very, very slowly in some cases, and Trump made a really phenomenal, took advantage of the court's slowness to just slow walk a bunch of cases that he didn't like. But he didn't manage to stop them. So one of the really important events of the past year has been Trump's defeat in the Supreme Court in a battle with the Manhattan District Attorney, Cy Vance, over his tax returns. So Cy Vance and the Attorney General of New York State, Letitia James, have been running a pretty aggressive pair of investigations aimed at Trump's finances. That investigation is immune from federal pardon. There is no way that Trump could pardon that away. So, because those would be state charges if they're ever brought, and federal pardons don't impact state charges. So this is going to be potentially, looking forward, another case of figuring out whether the system holds and how the system works. I think that if they find evidence that Trump clearly committed crimes, they still have a decision to make, which is a prudential judgment decision of whether to try to bring charges. And you could argue that charges against a former president would be so damaging to the country that they would tear us apart, that we couldn't handle it, which was essentially Gerald Ford's argument in favor of pardoning Richard Nixon. On the other hand, you could argue that to let a president get away with breaking the law would be to declare him above the law. And, didn't we fight a revolution against England a couple hundred years ago over questions like that? So, I think in some ways the question about whether or not Trump faces criminal charges is almost more a question about what kind of country are we, which side do we want to err on, than it is about what exactly did Trump do. So that's going to be something that, looking forward into 2021, is going to be something I'm paying a lot of attention to.
Well, thank you, Greg. Seb Walker, you not only serve as our DC bureau chief, but you're also one of our most senior and seasoned reporters, correspondents, and producers on the ground. You're in DC now. A lot happened there this year. What was it like covering the protests there, covering the extraordinary federal intervention into protests there, just everything that happened in DC? What stays with you?
I mean, it's been the most insane year you could possibly imagine. I spent a lot of time before this in the Middle East. I was Vice's Middle East bureau chief. So coming to DC was supposed to be a real kind of change of pace in that sense, in terms of, riot police in the streets and, helicopters overhead and kind of scenes that you might expect to see in that part of the world. But this year in DC, this summer, the way that the protests were handled really produced these scenes that I've never seen before in this city. I've been in DC in years past, but I was there on the first weekend of the protests after the killing of George Floyd, and the scenes outside the White House in Lafayette Square, I just never imagined that I'd see anything like that in my lifetime. I mean, it was tear gas, flashbang grenades, police using riot shields to disperse crowds. It was incredibly intense. And I remember I'd actually just got back to town on the night of the first protest, and we went straight down to the White House when we heard what was happening. And it was just, you got this kind of sense of not a kind of disconnection from the part of law enforcement, a lack of understanding about what was really going on in this country, how angry people were, and what was needed at that moment. And I think that, when people aren't being listened to, you get that kind of in the streets, no matter what country you're in. And it was amazing to see it happen here. It was really kind of a very seminal moment for me. I've covered protests in this country as well, and to see that taking place here, just yards from the White House, was kind of surreal.
Now, I remember having the feeling of like, oh wow, we're living through history right now. This especially what happened in Lafayette Square that one day. This is something we're going to remember. I remember watching on TV. I remember that night, writing to the footage that we had, and realizing that we're experiencing it as journalists on the ground. We are delivering the news gathering that we do to the audiences that watch us. But it's also challenging. And I imagine from a broader news gathering perspective, like DC this year, this administration, what happened, both the pandemic, the civil rights movement of our time, and an election, presented, yes, many opportunities for us to live history and do what we do, but then a lot of just challenges as a result. Like, what do you remember being some of the more sticky or harder challenges that you guys had to overcome?
Totally, you're absolutely right. I mean, that kind of perfect storm of all those things combining was incredibly challenging to cover as journalists. We, up until that point, I mean, that was right in the midst of when things were, some of the worst points in the crisis. The infection levels were incredibly high. The country was in lockdown to a large extent, and as journalists, we hadn't really been out on the streets amid large numbers of people. Other people that we met on the streets hadn't done that either. It was a real kind of turning point, I think, from our standpoint of covering this story. It was it was very challenging to try to do that, keep our crews safe, try to maintain all the protocols that we needed to prevent, COVID infection. We've had a huge emphasis on that throughout the year. Our security team has been just every day across who's doing what, which teams are going out where, and kind of giving very, very particular guidance on a case-by-case basis. But trying to kind of cover these very, very important stories as well as keeping our crew safe was incredibly challenging. I mean, you're at one level needing to cover this incredibly important story, as you said, the civil rights moment of our times, and at the same time, you don't want to be putting your team in danger. You don't want to be putting people that you meet in any added danger. But everything was just happening so fast that you're making decisions very quickly. So for that protest moment, it was a real kind of turning point. I think a lot of the news organizations hadn't really been out filming since COVID had really started, and that was a moment when I think a lot of journalists around the country thought, well, this is so important that we need to report this story. But then COVID and how that's factored into the coverage of the election, it's been so hard to try to figure out ways of coming up with distinctive ways of covering the political issues, the issues that really matter, going around the country to places that are not being reported on, and still kind of maintaining that cautiousness that you need to do around being a journalist in this time of a deadly virus. So it's just been a kind of case-by-case basis, feeling our way around what's appropriate, what's acceptable, and erring on the side of caution, but still getting out there, going to places. We have sent our teams, across the country into the Midwest, onto the Navajo reservations in Arizona and Utah. We've been down to Florida, reporting on QAnon. We've had huge emphasis on what's going on the Hill, obviously. And it's been a very formative experience for our team in DC. And I think everyone really just hasn't really had time to think since March. We haven't really stopped running since then. And it seems the chaos is subsiding a little bit. But it's been, this has been a pretty pivotal moment for everybody.
As far as challenges are concerned, this year was extraordinary in the challenges that everyone was facing. I mean, the economic toll, the numbers of unemployed, the numbers newly into poverty, the numbers themselves started to not even make sense anymore. They were so big. And that's partly, I think, as indicative of how overwhelming the big stories of the year were, whether it was the election, whether it was COVID, whether it was the police killings of George Floyd. From where you're standing as a bureau chief, what were some of the stories of this year that you don't think maybe got quite enough coverage because of everything else that was going on?
I think you're totally right about the consequences economically of this pandemic. And I think that tended to be overshadowed at certain points of the year by, the election horse race, the campaign, Trump versus Biden, and all of the kind of political beltway types of conversations. I think that dominated a lot of the network coverage. And if there's something that I think probably deserved more attention, I would say just the economic crisis that this pandemic has caused. And we went down to Florida, for example, where places like Orlando have been absolutely devastated by this crisis. And you go to these food handouts where you'll get, dozens and dozens of cars lining up for basic food packages, like, a loaf of bread and some canned tuna fish and some very basic supplies that people are getting free and lining up for hours since the early morning. People who've never received this kind of handout in their lives before. But this crisis has, wiped out a whole portion of the economy in a place like Orlando. That's food and hospitality workers make up a large part of the workforce in that place. So when people are canceling their vacations, this puts people out of their homes. I mean, there are people who have been evicted. There are people who are living in motels. There are people who are living on the streets. We met somebody who was being evicted from their home, who traveled down just before the pandemic started to take a job in Orlando, and was being forced to move his belongings out of his residence by the local sheriff, and no place to go. And I think that the political conversations kind of overshadowed some of that and obscured the reality of what's happening for so many Americans across the country. And I think if there's something now to focus on, and it's something that we will be focusing on, it's what's really happening in people's lives, and what is the reality of this crisis in people's pockets, and how are people surviving.
Well, it's a big job for 2021, but thanks for everything in 2020. See you in a couple weeks, I guess.